Hello Internet, I'm John Brill, and this is Accountability on the Local Level Part 1, the One-Man Campaign. In the video on accountability, we defined accountability as a measure of how easy it is for a challenger to unseat a sitting incumbent. And we also examined how the most significant factor that affects how accountable a sitting incumbent can be is the size of the constituency he is elected to represent. We examined the logistics of mounting a one-man campaign in districts with 5,000, 20,000, and 80,000 constituents. The more potential voters there are, the harder it is for a challenger to meet the organizational hurdles to mount a successful campaign. So, how can we make challenging incumbents easier on the challengers? By decreasing the district size. In this series, we will be examining how to do that on the local level. So, how difficult do you think it should be to run for local office? Should you have to be independently wealthy in order to run for local office? Should you have to devote the previous decade or so of your life to preparing yourself to run for local office? Should you have to be a full-time candidate in order to run for local office? Should the difficulties of running for local office prohibit all but the very few from seeking it? I think the answer to these questions is no. Being able to mount a competitive campaign for a local office should be something that pretty much any citizen ought to be able to do even while they work a full-time job to pay the bills. That means making local office district sizes that are small enough that a one-man campaign can be mounted for a general election. And to be clear, a one-man campaign is just that. Just the candidate with some palm cards going door to door to talk directly with the voters of his district to ask them for their vote. And I'm going to hold the idea of the one-man campaign up as an ideal that we should be striving for in general with district sizes, and one that is absolutely doable on the local level. Say we have a spectrum of accountability with absolutely unaccountable at one end and absolutely accountable on the other. Where on this spectrum would you want your government to be? I would hope that everyone would want their government to be at the easily held accountable end of the spectrum. And at that farthest edge, one-man campaigns are possible. Presently, districts are increasingly unaccountable due to population growth over time. To reverse that, it would be useful to have a framework to keep us on the accountability end of the spectrum. So I would say that the ideal for a one-man campaign is 5,000 or fewer voters per district. We would thereby lower the hurdles candidates need to overcome to run for office. We would reduce the importance of money in local races to near zero. We thereby make running for office more broadly accessible to a wider percentage of the population. We also make it easier for the office holder to do their job because fewer constituents are easier to represent. And we create a wider bench of potential candidates for state and federal offices where the hurdles are even larger. But we should define something of an upper limit in terms of population that a district could be that would still be conducive to the candidate being able to knock on the door of every single voter. When does a district become so large that it is no longer one-man campaign friendly? We need to identify that so that as districts approach and pass that point, that the public can know that it is time to increase the number of districts again, or just have a system that automatically increases the number of districts as the population grows. So that upper limit, I'm going to say, is about 10,000 constituents. 10,000 constituents might mean about 4,000 doors that need to be knocked on. If our candidate is knocking on doors every week for 8 months, then he would need to knock on an average of 125 doors a week in order to knock on the door of every single potential voter in the course of one campaign. Now, 125 doors might not sound like much, but this is where the bottleneck occurs for one-man campaigns. How long would it take to knock on those 125 doors a week? It would vary from person to person. For myself, when going door to door for candidates, I seem to average about 13 doors an hour. That includes doors where nobody is at home and doors where the conversation lasts for half an hour. I could knock on the doors of 25 houses right in a row 1 hour, and the next hour only do 4 because they were spaced out a bit and we got into good conversations. It can vary, but I seem, over time, to average about 13 doors an hour. I've talked with other folks who door knock, and I don't think that is too far off the average that most people can do. So, to do 125 doors at roughly 13 doors an hour would take about 10 hours of walking. 10 hours per week for 32 weeks. Imagine adding a part-time unpaid 10-hour-a-week job to your 40-hour work week. And you need to do that part-time unpaid job for about 32 weeks. Adding a 10-hour-a-week part-time job is a significant time sink for just about anybody, but it can be done. Most civic-minded people, I think, could find the 10 hours necessary per week if they really wanted to. They don't have to learn crazy fundraising skills, they don't need to have a campaign office, they don't need to coordinate volunteers. They don't need to do all kinds of things that get candidates for larger districts running around with their heads cut off. A candidate that works Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, could strive to knock on doors for a few hours after work each weekday, and for the whole of the weekend. I say strive because the weather does not always cooperate, and baseball games, weddings, funerals, birthdays, and anniversaries occur. Even with inclement weather and all those life events, a lot of people could find that 10 hours a week that they need in order to be a candidate. And that's pretty much why I think 10,000 should be viewed as the maximum district size for local offices. The district could be 7,000, 5,000, 3,000, or smaller, and those smaller numbers would be all the better. But as far as looking for a maximum number of constituents that would make running for office realistically within the reach of a one-man campaign, then I think about 10,000 is that upper limit. I remember one conversation with an office holder I met going door to door. He was a young professional with a family to take care of. He ran in a district of about 8,000 people. I observed he could mount a one-man campaign and that $500 would be enough for palm cards. He nodded, saying that was as much as he had ever spent on a race, affirming that it was a one-man campaign, but then added very soberly that it was very hard. That's why I say 5,000 or fewer is ideal. 5,000 people would probably mean about 2,000 doors to knock on, and that would work out to be about 63 doors a week for 32 weeks. At 13 doors an hour, that becomes about 5 hours of walking per week. Doesn't a 5-hour-a-week part-time unpaid job for 32 weeks sound better than a 10-hour one? Sure does. Do you think a lot more people would be able to handle running in a district of 5,000 rather than 10,000? Too right they would, and numbers smaller than 5,000 would be even better. With districts that small and smaller, people would not have to be independently wealthy to run for local office. They wouldn't have to spend the previous decade or so preparing themselves, and they wouldn't have to be a full-time candidate. Anyway, now that we better understand the constraints of mounting a one-man campaign and have a framework for gauging the maximum size of a district that would still make one-man campaigns feasible, we need to dive into some numbers. Join me next time for part 2 of accountability on the local level, as we start making local districts smaller while keeping one-man campaigns in mind. Thank you for watching, and if you like this, then click here to see more for Liberty.